Okay, welcome to this presentation related to the individual bones of the vertebral column and a few more things besides that. So the first things first, for this presentation, I'm doing this for students that don't have the vertebral bones to actually look at. So we're going to have to think about what we're trying to study. So here's a picture of one of the bones in the vertebral column of a human being. This is a superior view, so this is a top-down view. Let's see what it looks like in a side view or a lateral view. And the bones, like these vertebrae, then all stack together in this whole vertebral column, each one sitting on top of the other. They have many features in common. It's hard to figure out what is where until you've really taken some time to look at them. For example, this heavy part right here is called the body of the vertebra. It's here in the picture when you're looking down from the top, and it's that feature over there when you're looking at the bone from the side. Likewise, this piece that sticks out in the back here is this piece. So you can see from the top-down view, you would never suspect perhaps that it angles down so sharply. And the same is true for some of these others. If you look at the feature over here, these two little pieces that stick out to the side, those are right here. Kind of hard to tell that they come out at you. So there's a whole number of things here that you need to have more than one picture to really understand what you're looking at. The feature here that's sticking up in the air is this feature over here. So it takes the student a little while, especially without a bone to handle, but pictures to handle, to figure this out. And the vertebra within the vertebral column can all look slightly different. Like here are 3 different vertebra within the entire vertebral column. They all have the same parts, but you can see that the parts look different. I think this is a lot like when you look at somebody's face. So here's a picture of somebody's face. There's no 2 faces that look exactly alike, right? No matter how many different faces you look at, they all look different, even ones that maybe have some problems with them. But here's the deal. You know the pattern of a face. So you would never think that an ear would be found here on somebody's face. You know where the ears are. You know where the eyes are. You wouldn't see a nose on the side of somebody's head. This is how you have to treat the vertebra. Vertebra can look different. If you try to memorize one, you may have a very difficult time. But if you learn the parts and learn where they always belong on a vertebra, then you're going to be okay. So let's look at, we want to start with 7 typical features that you would find on all of the vertebrae. So, for example, every vertebra has what is called a body. I pointed that out earlier. This is the weight-bearing part of the vertebra. If you remember bones, this is compact bone around a cancellous core. And this body then has all of this other stuff attached to the back of it. And be aware of directions here. The body is anterior. Since your vertebral column is in the back of you, of the vertebrae themselves, the body is facing into your body cavity. Whereas these other features I've added are the ones that are sticking out behind you. So let's look at several of the objects. So I don't care which vertebra I showed you. I'm hoping that everyone could find the body of the vertebra. I think that would happen. Now notice that every vertebra has a hole in the center of it. That white area in the picture is a hole with bones surrounding it. That hole is where the spinal cord of the nervous system is. We haven't really studied the nervous system yet, but you and I have a vertebral column going down our back. You have a brain inside your skull at the top, and you have a spinal cord running down through this hole. The hole here is called the vertebral foramen. Okay, and that vertebral foramen of each and every vertebra is lined up with every other one, and so it actually makes a continuous vertebral canal, is what we would call it. So how does that get formed? Well, you can see there is an arch of bone that surrounds that vertebral foramen. Let me put the pieces of this arch in the picture. So I'm going to put 4 pieces of bone, 2 red and 2 blue, and together those pieces make an arch. Think of the golden arches, think of a rainbow. You can see that the red ones are attached to the body, and then the blue ones are attached to one another and to the red ones. And notice the labels here. The red parts of the arch are called the pedicles. There's 2 of them. And the 2 blue parts of the arch are called the lamina. So in every vertebra, you should be able to find a body, a vertebral foramen, 2 pedicles, and 2 lamina. And the pedicles and lamina create a bony arch that forms the vertebral foramen. Now, what else would we see here? There are 3 pieces sticking out the sides and the back of the vertebra. So this one that sticks straight out the back, you can see, is called the spinous process. And the 2 that stick out on the sides are alike, and they're called the transverse processes. So together, that's a total of 7 objects that you would want to be able to locate on each and every vertebra. The body, the vertebral foramen, the vertebral arch with its 2 pedicles and its 2 lamina, the spinous process, and the 2 transverse processes. Now, all the vertebra, there are 24 vertebrae in the vertebral column, and all of them have all of these parts, actually except for one. There is one exception, but we'll deal with that at the end. Let's learn the pattern of the 23. So here's 3 different vertebrae. Can you find the body on each one? I think you can, even though they're slightly different shape and different size. All 3 of these have pedicles. We were looking at the pedicles on this vertebra before, but this vertebra here has pedicles. This vertebra has pedicles. This vertebra has lamina, and so does this one, and so does this one. And notice you have to be able to name these by location and the way they surround the vertebral foramen. And you can see now a vertebral foramen clearly in each one of these 3 different vertebrae. Each of these 3 has a spinous process. Notice that the small one up on the left has a spinous process that kind of forks, divides into 2 little prongs, whereas the other 2 do not. And each of these have transverse processes. But notice some of them are prominent, again, on that vertebra up on the left. That transverse process is quite small, don't you think? Yeah. So these are the 7 common features. You want to be able to locate these on any sort of a picture. If you look at a picture like this that shows you the vertebra from the top or from the side, you want to be able to find all of those features. On your handout, under the individual vertebra, these are the first 7. Now, there are actually 4 more features on a vertebra, And if you look at the last four on the list there, you'll see they all have the word articular in them. There are articular processes and articular facets. There are superior ones and inferior ones. The key to finding these is to understand the word articular. And you know that comes from the word articulation, which means a joint. Every vertebra has features on it that create joints with the neighbor vertebra above it and the neighbor vertebra below it. There are four of these, and I want to introduce those to you now. In this picture, you see over on the right several vertebra sitting above and below each other. And notice that toward the back, each vertebra is touching the vertebra above it and the vertebra below it. And let me just help you with that a bit. Each vertebra has a process that reaches up and a process that reaches down, a process that reaches up to the vertebra above it, and a process that reaches down to the vertebra below it. These match one another on various vertebrae. You can see these here where each vertebra is touching one another. Now see if you can find that over in the picture on the left where you have just a single vertebra. Can you see the piece that sticks up to reach up to the vertebra above it? In this picture, the processes meet on the anterior part, on the posterior part here of the intervertebral foramen. And you remember that the intervertebral foramen was in the other picture, or I'm sorry, in the other lecture that we did first. So let's point out these processes. Over on the picture on your left, you can see I've colored in red the processes. And remember, a process is just a piece of bone that sticks up. Each one of these bony pieces, though, has a flat surface on it. Notice that sort of triangular, that funny shape to the process. But each process now has a facet on it. These are the superior articular facets in red, with the flat side of the facet of the process being the facet. So the process is the whole thing. The facet is just one side of it. And the facet is flat. That's the general meaning of that word facet, is a flat surface. When you look back at the vertebral column on the right, perhaps you can see how those processes and facets reach up. And then there's an accompanying feature on the bottom. Let me show you the posterior or the inferior ones. This little rounded area that I'm pointing to on this vertebra is the inferior articular process. And you can't see it, but on the side of that process facing forward, there is also a facet. So let's take another look at a vertebral column that's a little bit more separated. And now maybe we can see that a little bit better. Here are the two superior articular processes, one from one vertebra and one on the next. But if you went all the way down the column, you could see every single bone has a superior articular process. But each and every bone also has an inferior articular process. Notice that the inferior articular process of one bone reaches down to touch the superior process of the bone below it. Okay, so here's the superior process of the lower bone, and then you can see the inferior process on the bone above it. And see how they're touching. See how they're touching there. So that is where the joint is. The joint is right there where you see all of that little activity going on. And this is why we call them the articular processes. The part of the process, though, that is actually touching the other bone is the facet side of the process. So if we put a bone in like this, here is the superior process, here's the inferior process, here is the facet, which is going to touch the facet of the other bone. So you want to be able to locate and pick out the superior and inferior articular facets and processes of a vertebral bone. They're always the parts that stick up. Now, like the other parts of the vertebra that have different shapes and different sizes, this is the case here as well. If you look closely at this picture, you can see that the facets are facing toward the rear, posteriorly, and toward the front, anteriorly. Other bones have processes and facets that face differently. For example, here's a lumbar vertebra. You can see a stack of 3 of them there. You can see them from the side. The part of the vertebra that sticks up and reaches up to touch the bone above it is right here. So you can see they're touching in the exact same place, right? That each bone has a superior articular process and an inferior articular process. Here you can actually see the facet on it. In the picture above, not the side view, but the top view or superior view, here are what those superior articular processes look like. And you can see that the facets actually face inwardly or medially. In the picture below it, the side view, notice that the inferior articular process has a sideways facing facet, so that the inferior articular facets actually fit right inside the superior facets of the bone below it. So kind of a tricky thing to see. You have to see it from a number of different angles, but these are how the lumbar vertebra attach to one another. They actually fit inside one another like you see here. So, as we're saying, this is how one vertebra attaches to the vertebra above it and below it. Every vertebra is attached in 3 places, right? The bodies and the intervertebral discs attach every vertebra to its neighbor, but then every vertebra also holds hands with the neighbor above it and the neighbor below it with these articular facets. So, one of the ways that you can distinguish some of the vertebrae from one another, like the picture you're seeing here is a thoracic vertebra. It has facets that are facing anterior and posterior. The lumbar vertebra had facets that were facing in medial and lateral. So this is one way to really see the difference. They're the same feature, but they have different shapes, like 2 people having different shaped eyes or different shaped noses. So cervical vertebra, thoracic vertebra, lumbar vertebra all have these parts that you see here. Now, there are a number of features on the cervical vertebra that are different, and especially the first two cervical vertebra. But just before we get there, let's point out one very special feature that we would see on all cervical vertebra. Every cervical vertebra has not only the vertebral foramen, but two little foramina that sit alongside the transverse processes of the bone. And so these two holes are called the transverse foramina. So that's number one. Every cervical vertebra has it. If it's not a cervical vertebra, it does not. So thoracic and lumbar do not have these. If I were to ask you, if I were to show you a vertebra and were to ask you which type is it a cervical, thoracic, or lumbar, you should be able to tell me a cervical one by seeing those transverse foramina. Now, as I said before, the very first two vertebrae in the cervical area are special vertebra. They form a special rotating joint, and they have some special features to them. The second vertebra is a vertebra called the axis, and it looks very much like all the other cervical vertebra, except for one thing. This bone has one extra feature that no other vertebra has. And you can probably see that fairly well here. There's a piece of bone sticking up. It's called the dens. This is going to form a rotating point for the bone that fits on top of this, the bone that is superior to it. And this is the C2 vertebra, so the C1 vertebra, the very first vertebra in the stack, fits over and around this. Okay, let's look at the C1 vertebra, which is called the atlas. And notice, here's the two bones in the position right before they would touch each other. The atlas bone fits right down over the dens and is able to spin around it. So here's what an atlas looks like. The term atlas comes from Greek mythology, and you may have seen at some point a picture or a statue of a big, hulking, buff kind of guy holding the earth on his shoulders. The Greeks in their mythology believed that there was this big, giant, godlike creature that was carrying the earth through space. His name was Atlas. And so they okay, good. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. I think you got a little bit of my family calling me to dinner. Anyway, the atlas here is least like all of the others, but it is the bone that holds the skull of the vertebral column. The very first vertebra is the one that holds your skull. And so like the Greek character Atlas holds the earth, this bone holds the skull. But notice how this fits around the dens of the atlas. And perhaps now you can imagine how the rotating of my neck takes place because the atlas is capable of rotating around the dens. Now, the other thing about the atlas is it's least like all the other vertebrae in the column. So some of the parts it does have are like, it does have a transverse process. You do see the little transverse foramina there. It's got superior and inferior articular facets and processes. They face up and down. It has a vertebral foramen. So these are all similar to every other vertebra, but the atlas does not have a spinous process. There's nothing sticking out in the back. There's no body. There's no lamina or pedicles on this vertebra. So after you've learned the other vertebra, you have to sort of learn this bone specially. What this bone does put in the place of the lamina or pedicles or the body or whatever are the two bony arches. So the anterior arch is this little short one that fits around the dens, because the dens is in an anterior position on the axis, and then a posterior arch, one that sweeps around the back and forms the vertebral foramina. Okay, so that's the atlas. Okay, what's going to be very important is you will be shown pictures of these on our practical exam, and you will need to be able to name the parts and name which vertebra is which. And I'm going to just review again here. How do you tell one vertebra from another? So when you're trying to be able to tell one of the three types of vertebra from one another, your three choices are the vertebra that are in your neck, called cervical vertebra, the ones in your rib cage, called thoracic vertebra, and the ones between your hips and your rib cage, which are the lumbar vertebra. So if somebody was showing you one and asking you which type it is, what would you look for? Well, the first thing you would ask yourself was, are there any transverse foramina in the bone? Like in this bone, you can see that there are. So if that is your answer right there to this first question, then you know what you're looking at and it's done. If there were no transverse foramina showing, then you would know that it was a thoracic vertebra or a lumbar vertebra, one of these two. So you need to ask a second question then of yourself to distinguish between the two. And the best thing to do here is to look at the shape of the articular processes and facets. So here in the thoracic vertebra, they're very flat. They face distinctly posterior and anterior, whereas in the lumbar, they face medial and lateral. So there are some very, very distinct ways to tell one vertebra from another. So that takes care of the 24 vertebra from your skull all the way down to your hip. The last part of the vertebral structure is the sacrum and the little tailbone called the coccyx. The sacrum grew as 5 vertebrae, which fused into one solid piece. You can still see the 5. You can see the fusion lines across the bone. These are called the transverse lines, and you can see them here. The sacrum divides from the coccyx right here. This is an anterior view of the bone. You can see how smooth it all is. You can see those transverse lines. Notice if you're looking at the posterior side of the sacrum, you don't see those transverse lines. You see several other features. You see from here the sacral canal. There was a vertebral foramen in each one of these bones that fused, and it left a vertebral canal. The very end of that canal is a little opening called the sacral hiatus. And then the other real obvious feature is what would be the spinous processes if these were individual vertebra. But here, all these little bony features sticking out in the back are called the median sacral crest. Median sacral crest. Notice on either side of the canal are holes. These holes would be exactly like the intervertebral foramina that show in the upper vertebra. You can see all the way through. The tricky thing here is that the hole on this side of the bone is not the exact same hole on the anterior side of the bone. The holes are lined up like two separate windows that were lined up, and you were looking through both, but each window or each opening is separate. So the holes on the posterior side of the bone are called the dorsal foramina, and the ones on the anterior side here, these separate openings are called the pelvic foramina. And you can see that's because they face into the pelvic cavity. Pelvic cavity is here. The other thing that you can see is when we slice through in a cross section of the bone, you can see what would be where the spinal cord is. You can see it coming out to the lateral side, and then notice how there's a hole toward the back, and some of the nerve structure is coming out the posterior hole, and some of the other nerve structure is coming out of the anterior hole. So that shows you that there are two separate openings, the dorsal foramina in the back and the pelvic foramen in the front. And even though they're lined up, so you can see through them, they are separate bones. Or separate holes. So if I label these things here for you, you can see what we're talking about. Separate openings. So those are the features of the sacrum that you are to learn. You don't need to learn anything on the coccyx. So we have the pelvic foramen on one side, and we have the dorsal foramina on the other side. And so here is what this presentation has been about. Cervical vertebra, with its two special ones, atlas and axis, thoracic vertebra, lumbar vertebra, and the sacrum and the coccyx.